A new wrinkle emerges with the Bills' Week 8 opponent and what the Bills can do to get themselves back on track. This week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I'm your host today, and just some thoughts I want to get into today. I'm going to start off talking about the upcoming game against the Panthers a little bit, and then just kind of talked about it a little bit on last week's episode, but getting a little bit more into ideas of how I think the Bills can get themselves back on track going into, coming out of this bye week after going into it on a 2-game losing streak. So starting off with the upcoming Panthers game, it's reported, after the Panthers game, Bryce Young leaves the game with an ankle injury, doesn't come back in, and is listed with an ankle injury. It was, kind of put out there very early that he was going to miss this week, and then it was kind of backtracked of, we'll see how the week goes. He might play. And honestly, I think that's just some gamesmanship with injury report management, roster management. I don't think there's a very good chance that Bryce Young plays this week, which would mean that the Bills are going up against backup quarterback Andy Dalton. And the initial reactions that I've seen, there's a lot of kind of excitedness. People are excited to see a backup quarterback, and it kind of makes the game all that more of a get-right game for the Bills. And, all they really needed coming out of this bye is a quick tune-up game before we hit this home stretch. And honestly, I would think I would rather play Bryce Young. And this isn't, Bryce Young slander. He's been making strides this season. He's been becoming a better quarterback for the Panthers. But there's a couple layers that go into this for me. And number one being that this is an opponent that we're playing after the bye. Sean McDermott, 8-0 coming out of the bye and his tenure with the Bills. They typically come into the game with a good plan. Sometimes, a little bit of a slow start, but seems like a good game plan for that said opponent, and they're able to come in and handle business coming out of the bye week. And it's not to say that a change to Andy Dalton eliminates the ability to do that. But when we're talking about the Buffalo Bills being on bye, having 2 weeks to prepare for an opponent, the first week of this bye week, you were planning on Bryce Young. And now it's, a whole different pivot to Andy Dalton. And it's not to say that it's not a very beatable quarterback. It's not to say that it's not a very winnable game. But it's different dynamics, right? And I think a big challenge that Carolina presents for the Bills is that their offense isn't really predicated on what they're able to do in the passing game. We've seen Rico Dowdle running crazy all over teams. They get Chuba Hubbard back in the mix, and their game plan has kind of been, we're leaning into the run game, asking Bryce to make some throws here and there. Defenses are kind of getting beat up, lulled to sleep in the running game, expecting run after run. They make some opportunistic plays, and that's been working pretty well for them. I think Andy Dalton adds another layer to this of just being a more seasoned passer. I'm not going to sit here and say a better quarterback. obviously up there in age. He's kind of turned into a career backup, but a seasoned veteran being able to just find soft spots in the Bills zone and maybe be a little bit more reliable or consistent in the passing game, combined with this running game, I think just presents kind of an extra challenge that I don't really need to deal with. So we'll see what happens there. But, going into the season, this very much looked like a nice stretch of, you know, early bye week to assess some of our younger players, coming out of the bye week to our first exposures to Ogunjobi and Hoyt, and we could kind of see where the roster needs are and, you know, come out of the bye against the lowly Panthers and have this kind of be a little tune-up game for them, everybody getting on the same page before you go on and take on the Chiefs. And the Panthers, for what it's worth, their record does not suggest that they are still a tune-up game. And I know we can look into opponents and how they've won and all that. I'm not going to do that. I'm the old cliche of you are what your record says you are. I can't sit here and I don't like sitting here and hearing people blame the Bills for who they've beaten, so I'm not going to do it to Carolina. End of the day, they have one more loss than the Bills, and they have one more game than the Bills. They're 4-3. The Bills are 4-2. This is a team that going into the season, I'd expect maybe have had a win or two by now. They seem to be moving in a better direction. I don't think they're any sort of world beater team. Still a team that you should be able to take down pretty handily, but the Bills have had their struggles. Carolina looks like they're headed in the right direction, and it's not the same tune-up game that I would have thought it was going to be before the season started. So I do think that this is a very big task for the Bills, and in particular, I mean, if you're listening to this show, I'm sure you've been on the social medias. I'm sure you've listened to some podcasts that aren't this one, and just some of the world is burning type of mindset. The Bills suck. Fire everybody. Got to make 18 trades. If you think that Bills Mafia was insufferable going into the bye on a 2-game losing streak, it's going to get real ugly if they come out of the bye and drop a game to the Panthers. So, a very crucial game. Not even in the big picture of the Bills. It's an NFC opponent. It's not the worst thing in the world if you were to drop a game to an NFC opponent. But particularly for what it feels like to be a fan of the Bills, this would be an absolutely devastating loss coming off the bye to the Panthers, and the full 5-fire alarm that would come out of this game. So, kind of leading into that, wanted to talk a little bit about what the Bills need to do to get themselves back on track coming out of the bye. And I know there's all kinds of speculations of names being linked to the Bills and trades we should make, and very realistic trades that could be made and very unrealistic trades that could be made, and all of these things that the Bills should do. And I kind of cautioned this on the last episode of I don't know exactly how many moves are going to come from outside of the organization. So we'll get into it on things that I think the Bills need to do to get back on track coming out of the bye. And the number one thing, and this kind of leads into the expectations that I have as far as a move being made, is number one thing is get healthy. And we saw a lot a lot of change with this team through kind of last season and into this season of saying goodbye to a lot of, long-standing players, getting younger, getting cheaper, and a lot of additions made in particular to the defense this year that we haven't really been able to see fully play out. It kind of starts right from the beginning of adding Ogunjobi and Hoyt and like immediately after suspensions announced. So two players that you factored into having a role for this defense that we haven't seen yet. Then you get into the injuries, and you know, we have Daquan Jones go out in pregame warmups before the last game. We've seen Zion Logue and Jordan Phillips and Fedarian Mathis having to play snaps at defensive tackle. Obviously, you lost Dwayne Carter, and he's not coming back. But as far as being able to get Ed Oliver back, when can Daquan Jones come back? We've seen some increased snaps from these couple rookies, but you also lost TJ Sanders in the process. Milano going out with an injury. Bernard's been a little bit nicked up. You had Max Hairston go on the IR before we even started playing preseason games. Dorian Strong looked like maybe an option to supplant Trey White. We haven't gotten a ton of information. He's on the IR. There's probably more that I'm not even thinking of right now, but just riddled with injuries. That's the defensive side of the ball. Offensive side of the ball, Kincaid missed the last game. Joshua Palmer gets hurt in the last game. So just kind of injuries all over the place. Definitely, again, common theme with this team is really heavily on the defensive side of the ball and not so much on offense. Kind of leads me into the next idea of, okay, so we're going out and getting help, right? I don't think necessarily. I think the defensive side of the ball poses a lot of complicated layers to, where you would want to add. And starting up front with the defensive line as a whole, I don't see any additions being made to this room. I think you bank on getting Ed Oliver, back to 100%. You've seen Greg Rousseau, Joey Bosa, even AJ Epinesa to an extent have been looking pretty good, and you kind of getting a reinforcement there with Hoyt. You have Ogunjobi coming into the mix, change up the snap count, and Deion Walker has been coming along very nicely as a rookie. So as far as the defensive line as a whole, barring another injury or something catastrophic happening before the trade deadline, I don't see any changes there. On the second level, outside of Milano getting healthy, I do think that we've seen a lot of good play from Shaq Thompson. And I think he factors more as, and maybe with how Bernard has been playing, that Shaq Thompson could be more effective as the Mike, and you could have Bernard, kind of move to that will linebacker, more of the coverage player. I think that would be a pretty extreme move for them to make in season. I think it would be interesting to see it tried, but I wouldn't predict that. I think the plan would be here, Milano gets healthy and you sprinkle in Shaq Thompson. For what it's worth, I think Shaq Thompson has been our best linebacker this season. So maybe it's a matter of playing more base personnel. I don't see a path where you get Milano back healthy and you're starting Shaq Thompson over Bernard. I just don't see that. He's team captain. He's defensive play caller. The team coaching staff loves him. So I don't see that being a path. But Shaq Thompson has been very good this year, and I think you need to find a path to getting him on the field more and whatever that looks like. In terms of the secondary, I think that we talked about this a bit last week on the show, and it's just a very complicated situation in that, yes, Trey White looks like he could be easily upgraded. There's a lot to be desired there. But when you have it in terms of Trey White was brought in to be your emergency player, your backup depth player, and you've already started platooning him with Dorian Strong, who ends up getting hurt. You kind of tried to do it last week with Jamarcus Ingram. That didn't look any better. And you now have Maxwell Hairston. His 21-day practice window is opening up. It's really hard for me to see a path where they're making some sort of meaningful investment to replace Trey White, to still kind of just be keeping the seat warm for Hairston. I mean, you're talking about making money work. You're talking about moving draft capital, likely. You're talking about getting a value that makes sense while you have Christian Benford as a paid corner on the other side. And not only that Max Hairston is waiting in the wings to get healthy and get right, but it's a first round pick. Like, unless the information inside the organization is not feeling great about Hairston being ready to play in this 21-day practice window, or he starts getting reps and just doesn't look right and they decide to shut him down for the year, maybe. I just don't. I see that as we have a 21-day window. I don't think that, I mean, he's had like 3 actual practices with the team. I would see it as very likely that he's not playing this week against Carolina. If you're even seeing things that you like in practice, I still think it's a very thin chance that the first game you want to activate him for is then the Chiefs. So I would see this being, very much towards tail end, getting into week 10, maybe the first week that we see Hairston back. And even at that, you still have, a 6-7 game runway for him to ramp up, get some reps, and hopefully be ready for the playoffs. So I see that as a very difficult situation to bring in somebody that is not only going to elevate you from Trey White, but still be able to take a step back once Hairston's ready. And that player also not costing you too much to bring in, both with draft capital and the financial commitment. I just think that's a very difficult line to walk when there's other places that resources could be used on this team. Lastly, with the safeties, it's not an idea that I'm crazy about, but I think the answer right now is in the building, and it's Jordan Poyer. I would have it a very hard time believing that you can't get an elevated level of play from Poyer versus what we've seen from Rep this year. Rep has looked bad. And while Poyer might be older and maybe a step slower, watching him in Miami last year, I mean, for the most part, he's still at least taking proper angles. He's still tackling pretty well. And I think part of the piece that's really missing from this safety room is that trust and the communication. And Joe Marino was talking about this on his show, and it was a very, very great idea that I hadn't thought of. But it basically along the lines of, we know Damar Hamlin was never, a superstar safety, but he was a veteran that was, you could count on him to be where he was supposed to be. He had the communication piece. He had lots of reps in the system. And perhaps that was kind of the steadying presence that allowed Rap to be a little bit more of a loose cannon like he likes to be, and kind of was able to keep that room playing at an acceptable level. And now you kind of have two guys back there in, you know, Rap having that bit of a loose cannon play style, and then just a little bit of Cole Bishop still being young, still getting his reps in, and there's no steadying presence back there. And if you can get that from Poyer, go for it. I think this would be the perfect week to see what he has in the tank and get him game reps. And you still have the trade deadline ahead of you if push comes to shove and you really need to do something. But I know the golden days of Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde are behind us, but Jordan Poyer was always kind of like that tone setter, that leader, a physical presence, and I'm willing to take a look at it coming out of this bye and see what's there and see what we're if we need to urgently make a move there at the deadline. The issue that I run into with the safety room and why I'm leaning more towards Poyer than an outside addition is, how many outside additions have we seen at safety that getting a full off season, training camp, preseason, that still can't be now an incumbent starter for what McDermott and Babbage want to be able to trust these safeties to do. And, you know, eh, this past offseason, Derek Forrest, a guy that I was really excited about, that never was able to make an impact. Previous year, Mike Edwards, trying to beat out Damar Hamlin, not able to do it. So there's that layer to it. And then I, start to see the chatter of Jordan Hancock. Let's get him in there. And maybe it's something to look at. I feel that for how concerning the levels have been from Rap, that if Hancock was ready to go and they felt great about him, that it would already kind of be in play. But maybe something to keep an eye on of a Jordan Poyer short-term answer, and we start getting Hancock reps and see what happens. I don't think that they can have their plan B rep for the remainder of the season at the level that he's been playing. So we'll see how that all shakes out. On the offensive side of the ball, how can the Bills get better? I'm also skeptical of seeing additions made to this unit, but I can find the path easier on offense than I can for defense, just because there's so many injuries and they haven't been able to see the defense that they wanted together, or even close to that, really, for any meaningful amount of time. What I think really tips the scales on the offensive side of the ball is this recent injury to Joshua Palmer. And I don't think there was going to be any investment made at receiver. I think Palmer was your addition and extensions you handed out, and kind of banking on some development was the plan on the offensive side of the ball. And I wasn't really anticipating a pivot off of that. We could all want it, but being realistic, trying to be predictive, I wasn't too enthusiastic about an addition being made there. Now, Josh Palmer goes down in this game, and that was the guy that you added to be kind of your separator, your field stretcher to an extent, and just a different skill set. And if he is to miss any sort of meaningful amount of time, this is where I could see an addition being made. I I I think that we've had too much usage from Coleman, and a lot of those throws are low percentage passes. And we saw with Palmer going down, we don't really have other options as outside receivers. You thought maybe Elijah Moore could factor in there, and first few weeks he had some touches. Then we see him inactive. Curtis Samuel looks like maybe there's something there. He can't stay healthy. Shavers, nothing against the guy, but he looks like he was your like wide receiver 5 or 6. That was a guy that cracked the roster from the practice squad. He shouldn't be playing meaningful snaps on the boundary. So I think that this is an area that they could choose to target. And, you know, there's some popular names out there that are ones that I would sign up for right now. I think Chris Olave is a name that's out there. There's, you know, some risk involved with his history of concussions. I can point to that existed with Mitch Morse and never really stopped us from investing in him or him being a long-term awesome piece for the Bills. I think he's kind of more of that complete skill set if you were looking for more of a true number one. Rashid Shaheed, also on the Saints, is kind of this sweet spot of something that I could realistically see the Bills doing, of a vertical threat, a separator, a speed guy. You can add in his, explosive ability in the return game that can, move Codrington off your roster, free up another spot for, some of this roster shakeup we're going to have to do with these players coming back from suspension as we get, more players healthy. I think Shaheed makes a ton of sense. There's some other far-fetched ideas out there, like Jalen Waddle. But sure, if Miami wants to move him in division, the money for the next 2 years makes a ton of sense. I'd give up the draft capital to bring in Jalen Waddle. I don't see that as a likely trade. Jacoby Myers, one that was floated out there. I think the money there is kind of complicated. There's not a ton of options out there of, a lot of guys that I think would make a ton of sense. Maybe Kelvin Ridley could make some sense. Seen some deteriorating play from him as he ages. Tyler Lockett just asking for his release and being granted it. I that could be like an emergency type of plan for me. I don't know exactly how much he has left in the tank. Obviously, kind of just his role being diminished with some emerging players, and to me, would signal that he would want to go to a team where he still has a chance to be one of the top guys. So maybe it doesn't make a ton of sense if you're expecting Palmer to only miss a week or two. But we see receiver as a position that gets moved more and more in the NFL these days. So I do think that there's a path to the Bills being able to make a meaningful investment there before the deadline. And one that, if I had to place my bets on where they would make an addition, I would expect it to be the receiver room. Other than that, the plan for the Bills getting better on offense is really just getting back to what you do well. And I think in the 2 losses that they had, it was kind of like this almost felt like a need to answer the call of, the Bills aren't throwing it deep. Everything's at the line of scrimmage or short and run game and blah, blah, blah. And the last two games, we saw the Bills try to throw more downfield, and it's been bad. And I don't know if it's kind of trying to force it because of this narrative or trying to show something different. So teams have to be adjusting what exactly the plan was there. But I would like to see them get more into their big personnel. Hopefully, Dalton Kincaid isn't gone long, because also with this, I need his snap share to go up. Lean into, those 2-3 tight end sets. Can be one receiver. Make that one receiver be not Coleman, because he's not scaring anybody. And then get back to having the running backs involved in the passing game. I think we've seen so much impact from this running back group in the passing game, and it's just very limited target shares for them. And I know James Cook had, some drops a couple of years ago and all that, but one of the things, like, going into those drops that makes them so memorable is how many of those, it was like 3, 4 in one season that he had drops that would have been easy walk-in touchdowns. And in that season, he also had quite a few meaningful catches that looked very similar. And I think for how defenses are playing you, the fact that you're not really scaring anybody on the boundary, and the team's trying to send extra pressure and keep Allen contained and, kind of dare you to beat them on the boundary, get the running backs involved, get the tight ends more involved, and lean into what you're doing well over, going back to last year. And that's using your big bodies, lean into the run game. And in the passing game, don't stop trying to force things down the field just to do it. Get back to what was working in the first 4 weeks, and that was taking exactly what the defense is giving you, making the smart decision with the ball, and not turning it over, and protecting the ball, getting more possessions. And I think that lends itself to having more control over the game script and kind of dictating how you want the game to go, and putting the pressure on the other team of, every team coming in knows that they're playing a preseason, Super Bowl favorite, a perennial contender, and put the pressure on them to feel like they have to make a play to win. And that's when the mistakes happen. And that's when this defense can be opportunistic. And yes, the defense has its shortcomings, but they are good at being opportunistic and giving you extra chances. And we've also seen stretches of football where the defense is the one that does their job and is carrying the weight, and the offense lets them down. So, 3rd and 1, we don't need to be doing a jet sweep. I know we got stuffed a bunch of times, and maybe you want to find different options on short yardage gains, but you can still do the tush push. You can still do the snowplow. It worked on immaculately against every team except for the Chiefs last year. 3rd and 1, we don't need to be moving horizontally and doing tight end sweeps. Run the ball up the middle with Josh Allen. Run the ball up the middle with James Cook, who's having tremendous production on the ground this year. Keep it simple. Get back to the basics. And I honestly didn't even have this one in my head going into the show, but I'll throw one more in there. Take all of your gadget trick plays out of the playbook. We don't need them. The trick plays are something that was fun and exciting for me when the Bills sucked. And, you needed to catch the defense off guard, to sneak one in on them, to have a chance in the game. You have arguably the best player in the NFL at your quarterback. You have a team that just last season, and you didn't change too many pieces from it, was arguably the best offense that this organization ever had. You had this continuous streak of scoring 30 points a game. I don't need to see flea flickers. I don't need to see reverses. I don't need to see. When I talk about Joe Brady being in his bag, it's him in his bag of just keeping the offense on schedule and taking what the defense is giving you. I don't need to see all the extra, particularly like on money downs when the game is in the balance. If you want to run a reverse on, 1st and 10, it's still not going to be my favorite play call, but go for it. But on, 3rd and 1, where the defense is likely expecting a run and you're starting out going straight horizontally, throw it away. Don't need it. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast. I do thank you for joining me this week. As always, if you've made it this far, kindly ask that you like, share, subscribe, tell a friend about the show. Make sure you're not missing any episodes. Helps them coming out every week. We're going to be meeting up again next week after the Panthers game. Hopefully we get to talk about a win that's getting us back on track. If we have any trades that happen in the meantime, we'll be doing a bonus episode to cover that. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss anything. Hopefully we get some news to talk about, moving us in a more positive and appropriate direction. We'll see what happens. Until then, and as always, go Bills.